Hi everybody, and thank you for watching another episode of Gaffer in Gear. In today's episode of Gaffer in Gear, I'm finally going to finish off my reviewing of the Aputure Spotlight Max. In previous episodes, I have had a look at the Spotlight Max in conjunction with the CS16 and the XT26. In today's episode, I'm going to finish off by having a look at the 1200D and also with this in combination with the 600C. Alright, so before we get into things, I just want to point out that this episode is indexed and chaptered because it is quite long. Now the reason it's so long is because I've tested all 4 lights with all 3 lenses. So that's going to be broken up into the chapters so you can have a look at whatever it is that interests you the most and skip the rest. Okay, now I'm also in a bit of a rush with this episode because I've got to get onto an aeroplane and head over to the USA. I'll be at Cinegear, so I'm just going to do a quick plug for that. So I will be appearing on Friday the 7th at the Aputure booth at Cinegear at 1 p.m. And on the Saturday, that's June the 8th, I'll be appearing at the Aputure booth at 11 a.m. All right, so I'll be part of a lighting panel, so there'll be me. You also get the added value of John Roach from Gaffer Salon and Luke Searveld from Meet the Gaffer, so hopefully I'll get to see you there. And don't forget to check the Aputure socials. If you can't get there, hopefully it'll be streamed. Okay, so because I literally am in a massive rush today to get this episode done, I'm not going to explain what this thing is, okay? I'm just going to make the assumption that you know what it is. We'll skip all that. All right, so let's just do a quick walk through of the unit and a quick look over. You've got a choice of 3 aperture lenses. So you've got a choice of a 50-degree lens, which is very unusual with lights with a COB attachment. So 50-degree lens, 36-degree lens, and 19-degree lens. Now, you can buy the lenses separate, and the unit is also sold with a lens, so you can pick which lens you want when you make your initial purchase. All right, so I said there, aperture lenses. So you can also buy an ETC lens adapter. Okay, so this is the ETC lens adapter here. This is an optional extra. So that attaches into the front and then your ETC lenses mount onto this. Now, I don't have any ETC lenses, so I haven't done any testing for that. All right, let's have a look at the rest of the unit. The thing I really like about this this projector mount compared to my other projector mounts is the lock-offs. I mean, the lock-offs, you've got dual lock-offs. One lock-off does a pretty good job, but when you've got the dual lock-offs, the light literally does not move from where you point it. I've got other projector mounts where you lock it off and then it sags. I've got another projector mount that I need to use a magic arm with it all the time. This thing literally stays pointing where you've got it. If you've got it locked off, and even if you take the weight of the light off the back, it stays pointing where you had it. So other projector mounts that I've got, you take the light off the back, the whole thing slumps forward and smashes the lens into the stand. That's not going to happen with this. It stays exactly where you point it, and that's even with the bigger lights attached to the front. Now, if you're using the a 600 series light with this, now I've got that completely unlocked. It is beautifully balanced with the 600 light. Okay, 600 series light, beautifully balanced. So that's completely loose there. So that's nice to see that. Although if you're using an Electrostorm or the 1200, it will be a little bit back heavy. Now with the 1200D on the back, the 1200D's Bowen mount is aligned differently. So when you put a 1200 on, it won't be sitting beautifully upright like this. It'll be on a bit of an angle, but that's okay. It still ventilates fine. Okay, continuing over the unit, you've got some rigging points on the top, which is good to see. Some, not rigging points, some safety chain points. That's very good to see on something like this. You've got 2 lockers. So one on the bottom here to lock the lens into place, or hold the lens into place. And you've got the one on the side. Now the one on the side mounts into the barrel. Okay, so you definitely want to have that one in. So at the moment I don't have the lens locked. If I point it down, it can't fall out because that locker here is stopping the lens from falling out. So that is absolutely critical. They do have a second locker here to help secure the lens into place once you've focused it. But I found that to be a pain. I actually don't use that because what I found is when you tighten that one up, it does shift the lens barrel up and down and mess up your focusing a little bit. So I just find I don't use that one at all. Now in the top, you've got your accessory slots here, and you've got 2 accessory slots, one for the gobo holder and one for the iris. Now the iris is an optional extra, it's not sold with it. Okay, let's have a look at the gobo holder. Now, one of the things that's unique about the Aputure gobo holder is that the gobos can rotate. Now, the reason they've done that is because the barrel doesn't rotate. So the solution they've got is you can put your gobo in and then easily align your gobo. Okay, so that half solves the problem because you can't rotate the blades. Okay, so they haven't really solved the issue in my opinion, but they've half solved it. But in the process of half solving it, they've created potentially another issue. So what's the other issue that's been created here? Well, in order to be able to rotate your gobo, you need a mechanism, and that mechanism takes up space. All right, so the issue I've got is if you're using this with the optional iris, the iris attaches into the front here in the slot. Get that in. Now, here's where our blades are. Our cutter blades, and here's where the iris is. So that's quite a focal plane difference because you need the thickness of the mechanism in here. Okay, so you can't get everything on a very close focal plane with the exception of the 19-degree lens. That seems to work pretty well. Now with the gobo, when you put it in, it sits on one side. Okay, so on this side it's almost plush to the edge, but on this side, it's set inwards. All right, so if I put it in this way with the gobo favoring towards the blades, now the gobo's here and the blades are here. So they're very close together focal wise. Now, if I want to do a mix of iris and gobo, and I want them to be on a similar focal plane, then I can spin the gobo around. And now the iris and the gobo are very close together. Okay, so that is something to be aware of. If you want to use all 3 in combination, it might not be possible to get the result that you're after because of the thickness of the gobo holder. Now the gobo holder takes A and B size gobos. It's currently got an A size gobo in it. Now it has a spring-loaded mechanism to hold the gobos into place. So on the gobo holder, there's a little indicator here. So that's where you press down against the spring, and then you press up on the opposite side. There's a little indicator here. You press up and that releases the spring-loaded mechanism. Okay, so that's a A size gobo. Now if you want to use a B size gobo, it is sold with a B-size adapter. Okay, so that you put your gobo into the adapter, and then you put the adapter into the gobo holder, and then put your spring-loaded ring into place. Now, one little detail I like is there's a safety release here for the gobo holder. So if you've got the gobo in the projector mount and somebody has it upside down when they're moving it, the gobos can't fall out. You have to release the safety catch in order to release the gobo. Now, also available as an optional extra is a 10-piece gobo kit. And this comes with a nice little leather pouch for storing the gobos in. Now, the last thing I want to point out is, let's say you want to store the Spotlight Max into a smaller box or onto a smaller trolley or something like that. The stirrup is removable. Now, the good thing about this is everything is auto-locking. So when you put it back on, all you have to do is line it up and drop it into place. And everything locks automatically. All right, so let's go through cost and what you get. And these are just some prices I found online today. So the price of the initial kit, $1,400 US and 2,200 Australian dollars. Now here's the thing to note, lenses, additional lenses, $700 US and 1,000 Australian dollars. Now for those prices, in terms of the build quality and the construction and what they're delivering to you, I think I can see where the money's gone. Okay, I don't have any dispute on that. Value for money in terms of quality of build and all that. But here's my concern with the prices. So if I've got this with a couple of lenses, what do I rent it out to my client as a daily charge? It's not the sort of thing I use all the time. I might only use this maybe 2 or 3 times a month. So in order to get a return on my investment, I'd have to rent this out at least 250 Australian dollars a day is my thinking. And that doesn't sound so bad, but then you've got to factor in we haven't put a light on the back yet. So they've also got the rental on the light. So in terms of the price of this thing, in terms of the build quality, I don't question that price at all. I think it really does represent, you know, reasonable value. But in terms of passing that cost onto a client, I don't know if they would go for it. All right, so let's talk about the case to start off with. And it really is a beautifully built case. But here's the thing I hate about this case, and it's my biggest negative with this whole kit, and that's the shape of the case. As an owner-operator, this thing takes up too much shelf space. It doesn't fit onto a shelf this way because it'll overhang the edge of the shelf. And if I put it in this orientation, it takes up the same amount of shelf space as two of anyone else's projection mounts. And that's because the Spotlight Max is stored with the stirrup flat. So it's taking up maximum sort of flat real estate in terms of storage. So I think that's a pretty dumb way of packing it for an owner-operator working out of a van or a small box truck. Right, so let's go through the contents. You get a space in the box here for the optional ETC lens adapter, and I love the fact that that has its own space. So from a rental company perspective, you know, gaffers might have their own lenses. I'll just leave that in the kit all the time. That makes a lot of sense to be left there. You've got a dedicated space here for the gobos. Now you've got 3 gobos that are supplied. So you've got a Venetian blind pattern, you've got a breakup pattern, and you've got a tree. And you've also got plenty of space here for additional gobos, which I think is fantastic. Now over here, you've got a dedicated slot for the optional iris. And I think that's really important that your optional iris has a dedicated slot because they can get damaged in transport quite easily. And you've got a dedicated slot here for the gobo holder. There's also another cavity up here. This has a safety chain in it, or a safety wire for rigging the light, but it is nice that you've got that additional space for anything else you might want to put in there, like for example, a set of gloves. Now, if you don't like the case, one sort of thing that's good about the case is the insert does come out. So if the case doesn't work for you either in terms of storage and you're looking to sell the case, that makes it more desirable to someone buying it secondhand because it does have space inside it. Okay, let's have a look at the Spotlight Max with the 50-degree lens in combination with the 1200D. And let's start off with some stats comparing this to the light with no modifier on at all. Through the Spotlight Max, we've warmed up about 500 Kelvin. The color renders roughly the same, and the light has shifted towards a green hue slightly by 16 delta UV points. So that'd be somewhere around half of a 1/8 correction gel at the most. But the interesting stat is we've lost 43% of our brightness. Now this combination does deliver a very even wide beam. It has very sharp blade cuts. There is some concaving, but it is minimal. And there's plenty of range for focusing and defocusing. Horizontally and vertically, we can create very thin lines. However, because the barrel doesn't rotate, this creates blanking issues if you're trying to get a fine cut on an angle. So this is about the maximum width you can get at 45 degrees. Now let's take a look at a gobo projection. And in combination with the 1200, there is a little bit of color shift as you focus. You can see the center and the edges are not the same color. Now let's have a look at the gobo in combination with the blades. And for this test, the gobo is closer to the blades in the holder. Now let's throw the iris into the mix and have a look at the focus planes. Now I'm going to turn the gobo holder around so that the focal plane is favouring the iris. This is the focal plane for the blades. This is the focal plane for the gobo. And this is the focal plane for the iris. Now let's take a closer look at a fine cut. Now depending on which way you focus and defocus, the chromatic aberration will either be cool or warm. The same applies if you're focusing and defocusing a gobo. Now, just something to note, if you expose into the blacks, you can see gobo detail behind the cuts. Now let's take a look at a circular pattern, focused and defocused. On closer inspection, you can see there's more chromatic aberration towards the edge of the beam. Now let's take a look at a random gobo pattern, and we have plenty of range for focusing and defocusing. But just something to note, you can get a ring around the outside of the gobo, depending on where you're focused. Okay, let's have a look now with the Spotlight Max in conjunction with the 1200D and the 36-degree lens. Now let's have a look at some spectrometer readings, and we're going to compare it to the light with no modifier attached. Through the Spotlight Max, the light has warmed up about 400 degrees Kelvin. The colour render score remains the same, the green magenta white point is pretty much identical, and we do have a slight increase in brightness, but only 26%. Now this combination has a beautiful even beam with nice sharp cuts. We can get very fine slashes horizontally and vertically. Now here I'm lining up the cuts to the framing on my garage door, and as you can see there is a little bit of concaving, but not enough to have me worried. Now because the barrel doesn't rotate, if you try to do a fine slash on an angle, you're going to run into masking issues. So this is as tight a cut as you can get at about 45 degrees. Now let's take a closer look at chromatic aberration as we focus and defocus. And I've changed the exposure here so you can get a better idea of what's going on. And just a reminder, you can rotate the gobos. There is plenty of latitude when it comes to focusing and defocusing the gobos. However, I cannot get an even focus from edge to edge. Upon closer inspection, you can see there's more chromatic aberration towards the edge of the beam. Now let's take a look at a circular pattern, focused and defocused. And again, upon close inspection, you can see more aberration towards the edge of the beam. Now let's take a look at a random pattern, focused and defocused. Now let's take a look at the focus plane with the gobos favouring the blades. This is the focal plane for the iris. This is the focal plane for the gobo, and this is the focal plane for the blades. As you can see, we have plenty of room to play between the blades and the gobo. Now I've spun the gobo holder around so that the gobo favours the iris. This is the focal plane for the iris. This is the focal plane for the gobo. And this is the focal plane for the blades. Now let's take a look at the 1200D with a 19-degree lens. And once again, the CCT is down about 500 Kelvin. The colour render scores are roughly the same, and the colour hue, delta UV or white point, has shifted a little bit towards green, but only by about the equivalent of half of a 1/8 correction gel. But on the plus side, we've gained about 3 times the amount of light. But if you're using a reflector system, this is still not a huge amount of light level. Now we get a beautiful even beam, and we can do very fine horizontal and vertical cuts. Now here I'm lining up the cuts with the straight lines on my garage door, so you can see that there's a little bit of concaving. Now once again, because the lens barrel doesn't rotate, you can't get fine cuts on an angle without running into masking issues. In terms of focusing and defocusing, there really is minimal chromatic aberration. With gobo patterns, it is not possible to get an even focus from one edge to the other, but there is heaps of latitude when it comes to focusing and defocusing. The same applies to random patterns. Now here I've changed the exposure so you can see the ring around the outside of the gobo. This ring only appears when you're in sharp focus. Now let's take a look at the focal planes. And I'm starting off with the gobo favouring the blades. This is the focal plane for the iris. This is the focal plane for the gobo. And this is the focal plane for the blades. Now let's do the same test again, but with the gobo holder in reverse, so that the gobo is favouring the iris. This is the focal plane for the iris. This is the focal plane for the gobo. And this is the focal plane for the blades. Okay, now let's start looking at the testing results with the 600C Pro attached. And let's start off with the 50-degree lens. Now I just want to point out here that the delta UV readings are a little bit funky at 3200 Kelvin. I verified these readings by testing my meter against a tungsten light, which gave me a 0 delta UV. And I've also changed over the head and changed over the controller. With the light set to 3200 Kelvin, the CCT is pretty accurate. The color render is the same. And the light has shifted towards magenta a little bit, but by nothing noticeable. But the big thing to note is we're down to about 46% of our original brightness. Set to 5600 Kelvin, there is a drop in CCT, but it actually brings it closer to the target value. The TM30 color render score is the same. The light has shifted slightly more towards magenta, but by nothing perceivable. And again, we've lost a lot of brightness level. We've got about 46% of what we started with. Now with this combination we get a very even beam, regardless of the CCT or the colour dialed in. Blade cuts are very sharp, and horizontally and vertically you can do very fine cuts. Even with very fine cuts, there are no obvious issues with focusing and defocusing. Here I'm lining up the cuts to the straight lines on the door to see how much concaving or convexing there is. There's a slight amount of concaving, but nothing I'd be too concerned about. Now because the lens barrel can't rotate, you can't create very fine cuts without getting masking issues. Now let's have a look at chromatic aberration on a very fine cut. When you're close to focus, you do see some chromatic aberration. This will either be warm or cool, depending on whether you're defocusing forwards or backwards. With fine linear gobo projections set at 5600 Kelvin, there is a little bit of colour difference between the middle and the top and the bottom. But with warmer kelvins and with colours, it's very consistent. The projection is not as sharp at the top and bottom as it is in the centre, but it's more than acceptable in my opinion. And we have a massive amount of range when it comes to focusing and defocusing. Upon really close inspection, you can see the chromatic aberration is different on the edge of the beam compared to the centre. This is with the optional iris. And again, with circular patterns, you can't get an even focus across the beam. But in my opinion, it is more than acceptable. And regardless of how extreme you defocus, there are no obvious issues. The results are consistent regardless of CCT or colour dialed in. Upon closer inspection, you can see there's more chromatic aberration on the circles towards the edge of the beam. Again, random patterns can't be evenly focused, but in my opinion it's close enough for background work, and you've got a massive range of focusing and defocusing. And the results are consistent regardless of CCT or colour dialed in. Upon closer inspection, you can see the chromatic aberration is different across the beam. Now let's have a look at the focal planes, starting off with the gobo favouring the blades. This is the focal plane for the iris. This is the focal plane for the gobo. And this is the focal plane for the blades. Now let's do the same test again. This time I have the gobo position favouring the iris. This is the focal plane for the iris. This is the focal plane for the gobo. And this is the focal plane for the blades. Okay, let's have a look at the 600C in combination with the 36-degree lens. And again, I just want to point out I have double checked and triple checked the delta UV readings here. I've checked my meter against a tungsten light source and it came up as a 0, so I know that's reading correctly. And I even changed the head and the controller over to verify the readings with the light. At 3200 Kelvin through the Spotlight Max, the CCT is almost spot on. The TM30 colour render scores are identical, and the light's colour hue shifts ever so slightly towards green, but not enough that I'd be worried about. And compared to the light with no modifier on, we have lost a bit of our brightness. Set to 5600 Kelvin, the light is closer to the target value when running through the Spotlight Max. The colour render scores are the same, but in terms of its colour hue, it has shifted in the opposite direction compared to 3200 Kelvin. It is shifted towards magenta by a little bit less than the equivalent of 1/2 of a 1/8 correction gel. And compared to the light with no modifier, we have lost a bit of light level. Now, just something I want to show with this combination is the shadows are a little bit green, but if you expose the light correctly, I don't think this is ever going to be an issue. This combination gives you a very even beam with very sharp blade cuts. Horizontally and vertically, you can create very fine slits. When lining up the blade cuts to the straight lines on the door, you can see there is a very subtle amount of concaving. And once again, because the lens barrel does not rotate, you can't create thin slashes on a 45-degree angle without having masking issues. With this combination, there is a massive amount of range for focusing and defocusing. And the results seem to be the same regardless of the CCT or the colour dialed in. Now let's take a closer look at the focusing and defocusing on a very thin slash projected from 3 meters away. And there's definitely no danger of the LED emitters coming into play. Here I've changed the exposure so you can more clearly see the chromatic aberration. When projecting fine linear patterns, the colour is consistent across the beam at 5600 Kelvin, and there are no issues with focusing and defocusing. The results seem to be very consistent regardless of the CCT or the colour dialed in. With circular patterns, it's not possible to get an even focus across the beam, but I gauge it to be more than acceptable. And once again, there is a massive amount of latitude when it comes to focusing and defocusing. And the characteristics seem to be consistent regardless of colour or CCT. Random patterns are the same. You can't get a perfect focus across the beam, but it's more than acceptable and there's plenty of range for focusing and defocusing. Upon very close inspection, you can see the chromatic aberration is different from the centre to the edge. And the characteristics seem to be the same, regardless of the CCT or colour dialed in. Now here I'm exposing into the darks so you can see that ring that sometimes comes into play depending on where your focus is set. Now let's have a look at the focal planes, and we'll start off with the gobo favouring the cutters. This is the focal plane for the iris. This is the focal plane for the gobos. And this is the focal plane for the cutters. Now let's take a look, this time with the gobo favouring the iris. This is the focal plane for the iris. This is the focal plane for the gobo. And this is the focal plane for the blades. And finally, let's take a look at the 600C Pro through the 19-degree lens. And once again, I just want to clarify that I have checked and double-checked the delta UV readings here, and I am certain that they are correct. Through the Spotlight Max set to 3200 Kelvin, the light is very close to the target CCT value. The colour render score remains unchanged, and the hue point on the light has skewed slightly towards green, by roughly the equivalent of 1/2 of a 1/8 correction gel. And in terms of the brightness, it's about 2.5 times brighter. Set to 5600 Kelvin, the light is very close to the target CCT, the colour render scores remain unchanged, and the delta UV or white point has again skewed slightly towards green, but not by enough that I'd be worried about it. And just like at 5600 Kelvin, the light is about 2.5 times brighter running through this lens. With this combination, we get a very even beam with very sharp cuts. And there's a lot of room for focusing and defocusing. Now I'm going to expose into the blacks here to show that the shadows do have a slight green hue, but I don't think this would ever be an issue if you're exposing correctly. The characteristics on the blade cuts seem to be the same regardless of CCT or colour dialed in. As are the characteristics if you're soft focused. Now let's take a closer look at a fine blade cut projected from a distance of 3 meters away. And as you can see, we've got a lot of range for focusing and defocusing without emitters coming into play. But one thing to note with this lens is when you're focusing and defocusing, the chromatic aberration goes between green and magenta, whereas with the other lenses, it went between cooler and warmer. With fine linear projections, the focus does vary across the beam. But again, I find it more than acceptable. And you've got a massive range of focusing and defocusing. Upon closer inspection, you can see there's a bit more chromatic aberration towards the edge of the projection. Now to show the difference in focus, I've got the centre of the gobo as sharp as I can get it. And as you can see, the characteristics are the same regardless of the CCT or colour dialed in. The same applies with circular patterns. You can't get an even focus across the projection, but I think it's more than acceptable, and you've got the same massive range of focusing and defocusing. And the results are pretty much the same regardless of colour or CCT, and regardless of how you have it focused. And the same pretty much applies to random patterns. Now I have exposed slightly differently here, so you can see the ring that comes into focus around the outside of the projection. And again, the characteristics are largely the same, regardless of the CCT or colour that you dial in. And now let's have a look at our focal planes. Starting off with the gobo favouring the cutters. This is the focal plane for the iris. This is the focal plane for the gobo. And this is the focal plane for the blades. Now with the 19-degree lens, you do have a fair amount of creative capabilities using all three focal planes. Now let's have a look with the gobo favouring the iris. This is the focal plane for the iris. This is the focal plane for the gobo. And this is the focal plane for the blades. Now let's have a look at how the Spotlight Max performs in conjunction with the CS15 here. Now this is lifted directly from the review I did on the CS15. So if you've already seen that episode, there's no new information here, so just skip ahead. Now let's have a look with the Spotlight Max. First off, with the 50-degree lens attached. And I was really surprised by how even this beam is. There is a little bit of blue colour fraying right on the edge of the beam, but as you can see here, I don't think it's going to be a problem. And the blade cuts are nice and sharp. However, the brightness levels are a little bit disappointing. Now it can do pretty sharp gobo projections, but there is a little bit of colour fraying upon close inspection. Now before we have a look at the 36-degree and 19-degree lens, I just want to point out that I've got some moisture in my lenses, and this results in condensation when the lenses heat up. Now this condensation is after the light has been running for 20 minutes at 100% power. Now some of my contacts have reached out to other users who have these lenses, and apparently they're not having this issue, so I might possibly just have some faulty stock. Okay, let's have a look at the 36-degree lens. And this gives a really even beam if you're after a spotlight effect. But there is a little bit of haloing around the edge of the beam, which is a result of that condensation. The results seem to be the same regardless of the CCT that you dial in. Now the blade cuts are nice and sharp, but there is some concaving. And you can definitely see the haloing coming into effect now. Now with gobo projections, I can't seem to get an even focus across the beam. Now let's see how this combination performs with the 19-degree barrel. And again, it's got a beautiful even beam. Now I'm filming this after the light's been running for about 15 minutes. But as you can see, there is a fair amount of haloing as a result of that condensation in the lens. Once again, the brightness levels are a little bit underwhelming. If you were looking to use this as a high output option into a reflector system, you would actually get 3 times more light level if you used the Fresnel in spot. Okay, now let's have a look at the XT26 through the Spotlight Max with the different lenses. Now the first thing people have asked me is, does this get hot? Well, this section here would be ideal for cooking eggs, bacon and fingers. Now the one thing that does get incredibly hot is the gobos. So not only would I be concerned about burning myself on these, even if you're wearing gloves, you need to think about where you're going to put the gobo down so you don't accidentally burn a surface. Now this gets hot to the point that I would recommend having a second gobo holder, particularly if you need to audition or change your gobos in a hurry. Now bear in mind with these that the gobos are held in with pressure. So you have to press against this point here and then push up against the gobo to release it. So that means you're pressing onto super hot metal. In terms of the rest of the unit, from the accessory slots out, the barrel is reasonably cool and I have no problems operating it barehanded, even if it's been running for several hours. And the cutter blades here, they're beautifully insulated, so you're definitely not going to burn yourself on these. Now one thing to note is that the Spotlight Max attaches to the light via the inside Bowen mount ring, not the outside A mount ring here. So what that means is that the sensor pins here are not detecting that it has the Spotlight Max. So when you dial in your CCT target values, they won't be correct. Now the dual locking mechanism can easily hold the weight of the XT2600. So let's completely undo this side and it's now being held in place with the locker on this side, no problem at all. But if you do undo that second locker, just be ready to catch the weight because it is very back heavy. Okay, let's start off by looking at the 50-degree lens. Now, just to note, this attaches to the Bowen mount, which doesn't have the recognition system. So I had to have it running at its maximum Kelvin of 6,500 to get close to 5,600. It really is amazing how evenly illuminated this beam is. Now, it does have a bit of chromatic aberration right on the edge of the beam, but if you're in a wide shot like this, I don't think you're ever going to see it. But just to note, look at the brightness levels. This doesn't give you much light at all. Despite having some very good cuts, it does have a fair bit of light in the shadowed areas. I'm lining up the cuts here with the straight lines on my garage doors, so you can get a gauge of how much concaving or convexing there is. Now the barrel doesn't rotate, so this is as angled a slash as you can generate. Now this unit can focus and defocus without any color emitters showing up. And the results are the same regardless of the CCT that you dial in. Gobo projections have a massive range of focus and defocus. And you can rotate the gobos in the holder. But note here, I can't get the entire gobo in focus. But as you'll see later, if you're throwing a long distance, everything's in focus. Now I'm running it with a gobo inside, doing blade cuts, and I have the iris attached. And as you can see, everything is on a very different focus plane. This is the focus point for the iris, and this is the focus point for the gobo. Now the shadows are quite sharp at a distance, but if you get in close, you can see there's some chromatic aberration. And if you expose into the shadows, you can see the gobo pattern. And also you can see a ring reflecting off the gobo holder. Now, if you're shooting outside at night and you want a 50-degree beam that is perfectly evenly lit, this would take some beating. And you've got some real control over your lighting. Now, at this distance, you can see that a gobo projection across the entire house is in focus. Now let's combine gobo projections and cuts and see if this could be a handy combination on a night exterior. Now I'm just going through the focus range to show the possibilities. Now let's have a look at the 50-degree lens going through a window. And I've deliberately got the light low to the ground to show you a trick I use if I can't get the sunlight up high. Now, as you would expect, we've got incredibly sharp shadows, but sunlight wouldn't come in at an angle like this. However, with a projection mount, you can change the top cut and make it look like the sun is coming in from a different angle. Just bear in mind that if an actor walks into this light, they're going to throw a shadow on the background and it could destroy the gag if you're also running a gobo pattern. Now, there really isn't enough light here to sell this as daylight, but it could be handy for a moonlight effect. Now let's take a look with the 36-degree lens. And again, because this is running through the Bowens mount, it is not connected to the recognition system. So I found in order to get close to 5600 Kelvin, you have to dial in 6350. This has a very even beam, but there is quite a bit of light haloing around the edges. Now, other people I've spoken to who have this lens don't have this problem, but I seem to have some condensation trapped in mine. The results are the same regardless of the CCT that I dial in. Now the blade cuts are nice and sharp, but there is a bit of ghosting into the shadows. And there is a little bit of concaving on your fine slashes. Now, because the barrel doesn't rotate, this is the maximum angle you can make with the cutter leaves. Gobo projections are sharper from edge to edge, and again you can rotate the gobos in the gobo holder. There is a massive amount of focus range available on gobos, and at no point do you see the light emitters. The gobo and the cutter blades can be used together, but they are on very different focal planes. Now let's have a look with the optional iris. This is the focal plane for the iris. This is the focal plane for the gobos. And this is the focal plane for the cutter blades. Upon close inspection, you can see some chromatic aberration, but I don't think this would be an issue if you're running the gobos out of focus or they were at a distance in the background. If you expose into the shadow areas, you can see the rest of the gobo. And you can see a reflection of the gobo holder. Now let's try this out somewhere that's a bit bigger than my workshop. Blade cuts work beautifully over long distances, as does focusing and defocusing. If you're lighting something as large as a house, you can get even gobo focus from edge to edge. And here is the focus range. Even over long distances, there is no dangers of the emitters coming into focus. Now let's take a look at this through a window at a distance of about 6 meters. And once again, I deliberately have the light low to the ground. The shadows are razor sharp, we've got enough light level for this to be convincing as daylight, and we can also use the blades to effect. And the shadow qualities remain the same regardless of the colour that you dial in. Now let's take a look at the 19-degree lens. And again, you have to dial in a way higher CCT value to get 5600 Kelvin. Now the results are pretty much the same. It's just the beam is tighter and the levels are brighter. Once again, there's no real difference in the characteristics depending on the CCT that you dial in. Blade cuts are still nice and sharp. You still have the same angle limitations with the blades. And you've still got the same massive focus and defocus range on your gobos. The optional iris still works really good. This is the focal plane for the iris. This is the focal plane for the gobo. And this is the focal plane for the blades. Upon close inspection, there is minimal chromatic aberration compared to the other lenses. If you expose into the shadows, you can still see the gobo and a circular reflection from the gobo holder. The one big difference between this and the other lenses is this seems to have way more ambient light around the edge of the beam. Now I don't really have access to somewhere big enough to show the throw of this beam. Even out the front of my house, it's a little bit ridiculous. Although it could come in handy for highlighting background elements in a wide shot. Now the 19-degree beam can actually light the average size window if the light's coming in at an angle. Because it's 19 degrees, we have quite a bit of light level here. The shadows are still really sharp and we can play with our edges. Now I forgot to mention in the other segments that you can defocus your cuts. Okay, that's another episode of Gaffer and Gear done. I've got to get out of here and get on an aeroplane to Cine Gear. Hopefully I'll see you there. Take care.